Gather your supplies. You'll need your self fabric, lining, batting, pattern pieces, scissors, point turner, and hand sewing needle. I'll be using a pencil to mark my pattern piece. Locate your grain line and line it up parallel to the selvage edge using a ruler. Use pattern waste to secure your pieces on the fabric while you mark. Don't forget to mark your notches. You need 4 self pieces for this project. Flip your pattern piece to mark the opposite side. Repeat this step for the second slipper. Next, cut the soles of your slipper. Cut your self pieces out. Don't forget to clip your notches. Repeat this step for the lining and the batting. You may want to cut both sides depending on your fabric. I'm not going to quilt this one. Instead, I'm going to place the batting to the wrong side of the self tops and machine base 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Repeat this for all of your remaining self pieces. You're so good at this. With right sides together, sew center seam of tops, matching notches, with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat that step on the second slipper. Now do that same thing on the lining pieces, except with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Trim seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch. Now press your seams open. Be sure to use a pressing cloth if your fabric requires it. With right sides together, sew heel from sole to notch, with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat that on the lining pieces with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now your tops are together. Snip notch just before the seam. It may be hard to snip here because you have a lot of layers or you're using a thicker fabric. Just keep working at it, but make sure not to cut your seam. Trim that seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch. Now press those seams open. Stitch the booty top to the sole, right sides together, at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure to match the notches. When you're at the machine, sew with the sole on the bottom and the booty on the top. That way you'll be able to move the fullness around as you're sewing around the curves. Now repeat on the other booty. Now the outsides of your slippers are all finished. Let's trim that seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch. Turn those slippers right side out. Now we're going to repeat that on the lining pieces, except we're going to do something a little bit different. Sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance and leave a 2-inch opening at the side of the toe. Be sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end of the seam line. That opening to be really strong as we turn the slipper right side out. Repeat on the other slipper. Now press your seams open. Insert self shell of slipper into lining so right sides are together. Line up seams and pin in place. Make sure you line up the corners. Sew with 3/8 seam allowance. Start at back seam below the slash. Drop the needle into the seam and make sure you're sewing a 3/8 seam allowance. That's how you can be sure you're starting in the right place. Make sure to end your stitch line right where you started it, right at that back seam. Repeat on the second slipper. Now you should be able to see why you left an opening in the lining. End up pulling the outer slipper through and then slipping the lining inside of it. Trim that seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch. Do not trim the opening. Trim your corners. Have your pointer turner handy. Turn slipper right side out by pushing it out of the hole in the lining. Use your pointer turner to push out the corners so you get a really nice crisp corner. You may find that you have a lot of bulk at that front seam. Go ahead and trim that seam allowance. Pull that second slipper right side out. I'm pushing the seam out as much as possible to get a good press on it. This next step is optional. I want the opening of my slippers to be really crisp and clean, so I'm choosing to top stitch 1/4 of an inch away from the edge all the way around. If you'd prefer not to take this step, Then tack the top of the back seam just below the slip. Push the seam out as much as possible to get a really good press. Now you're going to close up the hole in the lining toe by turning in seam allowance at stitch line. Grab your hand sewing needle and some thread. Thread it up, tie a knot. Slip stitch the seam closed. Hide the end of your thread by coming through another area of the lining and snipping the thread close. Push your lining into the slipper shell and push the edges into place.